All right, good Friday evening, everyone. Thanks for stopping by for a check of our way too early fall and winter outlook. We're going to talk about what the CPC has for us for this upcoming fall and winter season. We've gone ahead and dug up some analog years that we think best represent what we'll go through heading into the fall months this year and then potentially into the winter as well. Going to kind of correlate that with what we've seen in the past for both rain, snow, temperature profiles. Just I guess one thing that looks abundantly clear is our temperatures probably are going to be a little warmer than normal this upcoming winter. So we'll kind of talk about that, why we think that's the case, and whether or not we can see maybe a snowy winter or a wet winter or a dry one. And that's what we'll be talking about in today's way too early season forecast. But do want to talk about what the Climate Prediction Center has for us for this upcoming winter season. This was posted yesterday by the CPC. They do have us under what we call a La Nina watch, which basically just means that we're not in La Nina conditions right now. We're actually in very much ENSO neutral conditions. We're not in El Nino, nor are we in La Nina conditions. But we do expect to potentially trend towards a La Nina heading into this fall and winter. There's about a 56% probability that we're still in ENSO neutral conditions through October. After that, we could start to revert into a weak La Nina and then maybe back into ENSO neutral conditions next spring and summer. So if we do fall under La Nina conditions this year, thoughts are it's probably not going to be very strong. Here we can also just kind of dig up some of the SST forecasts. So the Nino 1.5 region is what we look at a lot for our active pattern here in the high plains. You can see that, starting in, say March and April, we started to see it go positive, kind of cooled off, and then just has kind of stayed in that, half a degree above normal in this specific region alone through much of the summer months. And that largely could be attributed to why we've been so wet this year. When that water is really hot out here, it tends to lead to us having a more persistent precipitation pattern here in the southern high plains. But you can see as we go into the forecast models, a lot of them trending negative here over the next couple of months and potentially getting into, right there at just near the cusp of what would be considered weak La Nina conditions. So something to definitely keep in mind. The 3.4 has been largely negative. That's a bit further out into the Central Pacific. It hasn't really been positive all summer. It is expected to continue to trend negative, somewhere between zero point 0.5 to 1 degrees below what would be considered a normal anomaly. So we're running around a half a degree to a degree below what's considered normal. But as we get into April and May, it's expected to maybe trend back up towards neutral phase. So this La Nina that could materialize probably is not going to be a very long-lived one. So just generally speaking, if we do get into La Nina, probably going to be warmer, probably going to be drier, but there are a lot of contingencies that we're going to talk about here in your outlook. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at some of the best fit analogs that we have found. This was taken just the other day. This is our sea surface temperature anomalies. Hopefully you guys can see this okay. But all this red, all these whites and in the ocean would be indicative of above average sea surface temperatures compared to what is normally seen. You can see it's a bath up there in the North Pacific. It has been exceptionally hot. That is correlated with our PDO oscillation, that Pacific Decadal oscillation. And then here's your ENSO phase, whether or not we're in La Nina or El Nino. Here's your 1.5 region. This is what we like to look at here in the panhandles for rain chances. And then you can see, this is like your 3.4 region, where you've got more of that neutral to slightly below normal anomalies out there. I will point out it has been exceptionally cool up here in the North Atlantic. This is something that a few meteorologists have pointed out over the last couple of months. I've noticed it. A couple over at the National Weather Service have noticed it. Some of the Mets around the region have also noticed it. It's cooler than normal up there. That would allude to us potentially maybe being more in a negative AMO phase rather than a positive one. For those of you that follow the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, it has been positive since 1995. It is a very long-term oscillation that lasts on the order of 20 to 40 years before it trends the other direction. For a full cycle, could last 70 years. So it's a very long-term oceanic oscillation that does have a direct teleconnection to our weather here in the high plains. The question is, with all the CO2 emissions, our atmosphere, or rather our ocean temperatures just warming up in general, what does a negative phase look like heading into the next couple of decades? But we have been cooler than normal up here for most of the summer, and we've got a pretty good cold spot right off the tip of Greenland. So that could potentially, combat some of our La Nina conditions heading into this fall and winter. So here's our best fit analogs. Notice they're all very recent, and a lot of that has to do with this hot water up here in the North Pacific. But we've factored in 2024 to 25 season, the 21 to 22 season, and the 22 to 23 season for the strongest relations to our oceanic oscillations. We do have a couple of partial fit years, 2016 and 2019 as well, which we've factored in. They're not going to have as much of a weight as these three up here at the top. So here's the first one. You can see that we've got all of this bathwater. This is the current observations over the last few days. And again, just kind of highlighting some of these areas that we think closely represent all of those oscillations that we briefly talked about. We think last year kind of best shows what we could potentially fall into this upcoming season. You can see that our ENSO phase looks fairly similar. You've got a little bit of warm water here just off the coast of Ecuador in South America. Got a little bit more of that hot water this year, but you're right around normal in that typical zone or region that we look at. It's pretty neutral phase, maybe trending a little bit below normal for those temperatures. I mean, it was extremely hot out here up in the North Indo-Pacific. It's pretty hot here, not too far off the coast of the British Columbia and the west coast of America. And you can see there's a little bit of some cool water up here towards Greenland and Iceland. We've got a lot more of that this year. And so that would probably trend towards a little bit more of a negative AMO phase. So this is 2021, just looking at those same conditions. This is the currents. This is that analog year. You can see we've got a lot of cool water out here. Again, we were kind of starting to trend into a La Nina that year a little bit more quickly than we are this year. And so again, this could have had more of an impact on our precipitation in that year, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. You can see pretty hot here in the North Pacific. We do have a pretty good swath of cooler water in the North Atlantic as well. I would still argue that we've got a bit more of it, at least at a higher anomaly over there just off the coast of Greenland in that year. And then August of 22, you can see it's just bathwater out here in the North Central Pacific, but we do have a little bit of some cooler water here, but you can see really some hot water up off of the coast of California. And we do see a lot of that here. This is technically a negative PDO phase. We had a negative PDO phase of -4 last month, which is the lowest observed on record. Usually a negative PDO, you've got hot water out here in the Central Pacific and really cold water that wraps all the way up into the Gulf of Alaska. Now, that is something that doesn't necessarily look like it normally would in a standard negative PDO. You can see we've got cooler water down here east of the Hawaiian Islands and not too far off of the Baja Peninsula. But when you get up here into really the West Coast all the way up to the Gulf of Alaska, all that water's hot, but it's not as hot as it is out here. So that's why we're still in that negative PDO phase, but this is something that we're going to try and talk about a little bit later on. Does this hot water here off the West Coast actually provide us with maybe or at least counteract that negative response that we would see with a negative PDO? So that's something to keep in mind. August 2022, you can see we were already heavily in a pretty strong La Nina that year, but we did have some of that hot water there off the coast of South America. And then just a couple of partial fits. You can see a lot of hot water here just off the coast. This is a little bit closer to a neutral phase for a PDO, so that's why we didn't weight it as heavily as those first three. And you can see we've got a lot of hot water up here in the North Atlantic, whereas it's kind of flip-flopped over here. But we were in a trending La Nina that year, and so we did get it at least a partial fit for what we would potentially see this upcoming season. And then same thing for August of 2016. You can see we've got this inverted look to the Atlantic, or at least the North Atlantic. Pretty strong signal for a La Nina. And then we've got a lot of colder water out here in the Pacific. So again, I don't think this year specifically is going to correlate as well as those first three that we looked at. But we went ahead and gave you kind of a composite analysis of what the anomalies at the geopotential height looked like, just waiting all 5 of those years from September to November Geopotential height, you're just talking about ridges and troughs. And you can see that we've got some really high heights up here just around the northern half of the Quebec province, back up towards Hudson Bay. So this would be really indicative of a pretty strong ridge here on the eastern half of Canada. And you can see the signal not very strong, but probably some troughing out here off of the British Columbia, or at least the Pacific Northwest. So something to maybe keep in mind for this upcoming year. As we moved into the fall months, the general signal was we had kind of a trough out here in the Pacific Northwest. We had a big ridge out here over the Great Lakes region. And so probably some active precipitation ongoing up here. That's usually typical of La Nina, and then probably some drier conditions, specifically up in the Canadian provinces. We typically see drier conditions out here, but that ridge may be a little bit more pronounced and further north than what would be considered a typical La Nina pattern. So here's what the temperatures look like for those 5 years, just kind of smashed together. You can see we did have above average temperatures really across much of the country, with the exception of the West Coast. They had kind of average or neutral temperatures. Again, with that trough being more prevalent out here, probably have got more cloudiness, more rainfall, and so your temperatures aren't going to be quite as hot whenever you have that active weather pattern in place. As we get into the winter months, we're talking about December through February, you can see we've got a really sizable signal for a trough out here in the western portion of the country. Some big Alberta clippers coming through here, probably a good indicator of some precipitation moving through areas like the Dakotas and up towards Montana. Probably some higher heights out here where you've got a ridge, where you've got quieter weather, drier conditions down here in the southeast. Usually a pretty strong indicator where you're going to be drier, you're going to be warmer. And for the most part, the heat did portray there in the southeast portion of the country. Maybe those cooler and wetter conditions didn't extend as far into the Midwest as they would for a standard La Nina. But keep in mind, these are all weak La Nina years that we're factoring in. So that signal may not be as strong as seeing a lot of that cold air bottled up here and then getting through into the Dakotas and portions of the Midwest. I mean, they were still very hot even up here in New England, which is not very typical of La Nina. You typically see a lot of this cold air swing across the northern plains and then back up into the Great Lakes region. So that's kind of I guess the caveat to this is, though we are talking about La Nina seasons, these are pretty weak, and this is generally what we saw for those 5 years. You can see again, we've kind of got that exceptionally long coast exception, rather staying very warm over the eastern coast, with the exception being here in the Pacific Northwest. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the statistics that actually happened these 5 years. So this is our analog temperatures for all 5 of those analog seasons. You can see the averages for your 30-year average, rather, in yellow there at the bottom, and just kind of noticing all 5 of these years hotter than normal. That, I think, is going to be a very common thing that you're going to see here from some of these sites that we're going to talk about. Now, there were a few exceptions to the precipitation, and some of this we'll talk about has to do with the track of some bowling ball lows through the desert Southwest. We got pretty lucky in 2019, 2020. We had like 6 inches of rain in October that year. It was very, very wet one month, but as a whole, we did not have a lot of precipitation in November, December, January, or February. So this number, while we did have above average precipitation in 2019 to 2020, a large bulk of that came in about a 3-week stretch. And that just came down to kind of a smaller scale weather pattern, which you can't forecast this far out in advance. So I do want you to take this with a grain of salt. Generally speaking, was probably a little bit drier than normal, with the exception of that 1 year last year. Analog temperatures for Clayton, New Mexico, you can see kind of split back and forth. We were a little bit cooler than normal in 2019, 2020, had a couple of shots of some cold air that year, had a pretty good shot of an Arctic outbreak in 22 to 23, actually enough to actually keep us below normal for our temperatures that far to the north. A lot of that was bottled up there on the northern half of the area. You'll see this with Hooker 2 here in a moment, and Clayton, New Mexico, where they had a pretty good snow event out there, which impacted their temperatures for that month. Again, kind of a small scale feature. You can see precipitation there for Clayton. They were a little bit above normal in 2016, 2017. Again, our biggest links for the correlation are these bottom three. You can see drier than normal, a little bit above normal last year, but they had 32 inches of snow. They had that big setup in November, had a lot of moisture from it. They ended up having another big snow event up there as well with that system. Here's Hooker, Oklahoma. You can see those temperatures. Don't have any accessible data there for 2016, 2017, so we're going to have to go off of those last four, but temperatures, generally speaking, were a bit warmer than normal, especially last year, with the exception, again, a little bit closer to average for those years 2019 to 2020, 21 to 22, and 22 to 23. Much like 2019, 2020, had a pretty wet year or rather a very wet month in October. And so that number pretty high there. That's why we were above average. And then you can see we were pretty dry for the most part with these two seasons here. The best fit analog year, though, did have a very wet November, December last year. Pretty average for the snow amounts, maybe a little bit below normal. Clovis, you guys kind of had some split weather too. You had a pretty good snow event 2019 to 2020, a pretty good snow event there in 22 to 23. You can see that here reflected on your precipitation anomalies. You had 6.9 inches of snow in that 6-month time frame in 22 to 23, and you actually had 8 inches of snow there in 19 to 20, and a very wet year that year. Again, that was when we had all that moisture in October. A lot of that came during the month of October, but you had some additional moisture through the rest of the year that year as well. But our best link for the analog year, you were below average on snow and right at maybe a little bit above normal for precipitation and rainfall last year. And then this is the last town that we're going to look at in the viewing area. Temperatures screaming above normal there in the southeast portion of the country, or the DMA. And then you can see as far as your precipitation goes, kind of split, heavily favoring some of these drier seasons. Maybe a couple of these where we were okay, getting into maybe a more average year. But some of these average years, just notice your snowfall amounts. They're very low, 1.5 inches of snow last year there in Childress, 1.5 inches of snow in 2016 to 2017. So while the precipitation trend probably isn't going to be as strong of a signal for La Nina this year, we're probably going to be warmer than normal. That could definitely impact what kind of moisture we see when we see it this winter, this fall and winter. So here's my general outlook, or at least thought process on what we're going to be dealing with. So you've got that general trough that's set up there in the Pacific Northwest. Probably going to see some cooler weather through the months of September, October, and November as a whole. We'll still get shots of cold air through the plains, but from a 90-day perspective, we'll probably be a little bit warmer than normal going through the next few months here closer to home. Now, as we get into December and February, the reason that I've got us kind of closer to average for those 3 months is usually the back half of our winter months, we've got a lot of snowpack set up here. We tend to get more of those Arctic outbreaks later in the year this far to the south. You kind of have this step down process. Areas up north typically see winter before we do. That's usually how it goes. And so when we get these colder shots of air, I wouldn't be shocked to see some kind of stratospheric warming event this winter where we do get a lot of that cold air pushed down south. Usually we get 1 or 2 really good shots of cold air a year. Sometimes we get a few more than that. But again, that usually keeps us a little bit closer to normal. Haven't seen that above average weather at least show up significantly, at least in the winter months. So here's our general process right now. This ridge out here over the Midwest and the Canadian provinces, probably going to leave some drier weather up here. Expecting that trough to probably not dig too far south, so you'll stay dry down here in the desert Southwest. A lot of that precipitation getting hung up in the Pacific Northwest. And just again, kind of the thought is we may end up having some, tropical moisture down here that could aid. You typically get a pretty good active season in the southeast portion of the country for hurricane season when we're in La Nina conditions. Now, as we get into the winter months, again, keep this in mind. This is for December through February. We've got this kind of the swath you almost can see here where we've got wet weather in the Pacific Northwest and wet weather kind of from North Texas all the way up into the Pacific Northwest, rather the Midwest. Drier down here. This is a La Nina-like setup. This is kind of a La Nina-like setup, but this trough where you would see a lot of those active storm systems come through, I've got a bit further south this year. And the reason that I have that, and we're going to go back up here and show you what our overall PDO looks like. A normal PDO, again, keeping in mind, usually has a lot of cold weather wrapped up here along the West Coast. We don't have that. And so you've got this really sharp gradient in temperatures a lot further south than you normally would. My thoughts are that this may allow for that trough as it continues to set up later in the winter months to probably dig a bit further south. We may have several bowling ball lows dig further south than kind of expected. And so that's kind of what we're showing here on this outlook heading into the spring months. Again, this is December through February, not September through November. That's just an error on the graphic. So my thoughts are we're going to see probably some good lows dig through here if we can get some of that warmer weather to maybe keep some of these cold fronts at bay. I mean, when we get 5 to 7 days of return flow in the winter months, usually that's enough to allow for some moisture to build in. When we get the trough to swing through, usually we have enough moisture to work with to get some of these storms to produce some precipitation. So current thoughts for right now for the next 6 months or so, probably going to be a little bit drier heading into September through November. But as we get into the months of December, January, and February, I don't think that signal for drier weather is going to be as clear. I think we're going to have a better shot for some precipitation in those months. But keep in mind, if we're going to be warmer than normal, I do think that we may have some trouble maybe picking up some snow rather than rainfall. So that is definitely something that we'll have to keep in mind. So that's our thought process for this upcoming outlook. I hope you guys found it helpful. We're running on past 20 minutes, so we're going to end the live here. I do thank you guys for tuning in. Hopefully you found it entertaining, and we'll see how it plays out for this upcoming season.